What if Judas Iscariot's betrayal did more than just seal his fate, but doomed his entire lineage to oblivion? In the shadows of his infamous act, a whole family disappears from history. How could one man's betrayal transcend generations and erase names from the sands of time? Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 disciples of Jesus Christ, remains one of the most enigmatic figures in biblical history. Known primarily for betraying Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, his actions have been scrutinized and debated across centuries. This betrayal not only marked a pivotal moment in religious history, but also set into motion events that would forever alter the course of Christianity. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John each present the story of Judas's betrayal, offering slightly different perspectives that enrich our understanding of his motives and the consequences. This event raises profound theological questions about predestination and free will, challenging believers to ponder whether Judas was merely fulfilling a role ordained by prophecy or acting on his own volition. During this period, Judea was under stringent Roman rule, which caused significant unrest among the Jewish populace. The Sanhedrin, the assembly of Jewish religious leaders, felt particularly threatened by Jesus, whom they viewed as a disruptor of the status quo. These tensions provide essential context for Judas's actions as they reflect the complex interplay between Roman political pressures and Jewish religious traditions. Moreover, public opinion on Jesus was deeply divided. To some, he was a revered teacher and healer. To others, a dangerous rebel. This polarization is crucial for understanding the precarious position Judas occupied, caught between his loyalty to Jesus and the escalating pressures from external authorities. The Last Supper, vividly described in the scriptures, sets the stage for the betrayal. At this intimate gathering, Jesus ominously predicts his betrayal, subtly hinting at Judas. This moment is both foreboding and tragic, as it underscores the inevitability of the forthcoming betrayal. Scholars suggest that Judas's motives might have extended beyond mere financial gain. Some posit that he was politically motivated, hoping to provoke Jesus into declaring his messiahship. Others suggest disillusionment or a misguided attempt to manipulate events in favor of what he perceived as the greater good. As one of Jesus Christ's 12 disciples, Judas Iscariot was an integral part of a group destined to spread a revolutionary message of love and salvation. Yet, beneath the surface, not all was harmonious. The disciples, though united in their cause, grappled with the human foibles of doubt, jealousy, and differing visions for their mission. It was within this cauldron of emotional and ideological conflict that Judas found himself increasingly at odds. Judas, perhaps more pragmatic and financially astute than his fellow disciples, might have struggled with the group's disregard for material concerns, a stark contrast to the poverty they often faced. Scriptures hint at his role as the keeper of the money bag, a position that could have exacerbated his focus on financial stability. This responsibility, coupled with the disciples' reliance on the charity of followers, might have sown seeds of resentment, especially as Judas witnessed the lavish expenditures on occasions like the anointing of Jesus by Mary of Bethany, where expensive perfume was used. The tensions heightened as Judas grappled with Jesus' teachings against a backdrop of Roman oppression. While Jesus preached a kingdom not of this world, Judas might have yearned for a more immediate and tangible overthrow of Roman rule. This internal conflict between spiritual ideals and earthly realities could have driven Judas to question the effectiveness of Jesus' approach, feeling increasingly alienated as his hopes for a political revolution seemed unmet. Furthermore, Judas's discontent could also have been fueled by the contrasting receptions to their message. As they traveled and preached, the range of responses, from adulation to outright hostility, could have made Judas doubt whether their message would ever bring about the change he desired. These doubts might have been compounded by direct confrontations with Pharisees and Sadducees, where Judas saw the stark challenge of upending entrenched religious and societal norms. In this environment of internal discord and personal disillusionment, Judas's path began veering towards the tragic. His growing disenchantment set the stage for the critical decisions to come, marking the beginning of a journey that would lead to one of the most infamous acts of betrayal in human history. As Judas grappled with his internal conflicts, his vulnerabilities became apparent to the sharp eyes of Jerusalem's religious leaders. The high priests, ever watchful for threats to their authority and uneasy about Jesus' growing influence, recognized an opportunity in Judas. They sought a discreet way to arrest Jesus without causing a public uproar, which was likely during the crowded Passover festival. Judas, with his intimate access to Jesus and mounting disillusionment, presented a perfect conduit for their plans. The interactions between Judas and the high priests were pivotal. Initially, these may have been casual, perhaps even covert, probing Judas's dissatisfaction and testing his loyalty to Jesus. As these encounters grew more frequent, the conversations deepened, with the high priests subtly nurturing Judas's grievances, emphasizing the perceived failures of Jesus to challenge Roman rule effectively or to secure economic reforms. They could have painted a picture of potential disaster if Jesus' movement continued unchecked, suggesting that a betrayal could actually be an act of greater good for the nation. Parallel to this, though more speculative, Judas might have had encounters with Roman authorities. While not directly documented, it's conceivable that Roman officials, aware of the tense atmosphere, could have indirectly influenced Judas. They might have expressed concerns about the stability of the region or subtly praised Judas's insights into the group, feeding his ego and further isolating him from Jesus. The culmination of these interactions was Judas's tragic decision to betray Jesus. The high priest struck a deal with him, offering 30 pieces of silver, a sum that not only represented a significant amount of money, but also symbolically echoed the price of a slave. This act of accepting the silver was both a literal and symbolic point of no return for Judas, marking his full surrender to the manipulative coaxing of the high priests. It was a decision made in the shadows, driven by a complex mix of disillusionment, manipulation, and perhaps a misguided belief that he was taking a necessary action for a greater cause. As the Passover approached, the pressure on Judas reached its zenith. The weight of his role as the money keeper, his disillusionment with Jesus' pacifist strategies, and the manipulative coaxing from the high priests converged into a tumultuous internal struggle. Night after night, Judas wrestled with his thoughts, torn between loyalty to his master and the compelling arguments of the priests who painted his betrayal as a necessary evil for the greater good of the nation. It was during one such night, filled with restless contemplation, that Judas made the fateful decision. The narrative describes him stepping out into the cool, dark evening, making his way through the narrow, shadowed streets of Jerusalem to the secluded meeting place with the high priests. The air was thick with tension and the heavy scent of incense burning in nearby temples, a stark contrast to the quiet desperation clouding Judas's mind. Upon arriving, Judas was met with hushed greetings and the glint of silver, the 30 pieces he was promised. As he accepted the coins, each piece felt heavier than mere metal. They were the tangible representation of his betrayal, the price of his soul. The high priests assured him, with cold precision, of the righteousness of his actions, claiming that this would lead to a necessary confrontation between Jesus and the authorities, possibly forcing Jesus to reveal his true power or capitulate. With the coins clinking quietly in his pouch, Judas left the meeting with a sense of eerie resolve. He knew exactly where Jesus and the other disciples would be the following evening, in the secluded garden of Gethsemane, a place away from the crowds, and ideal for a quiet arrest. The plan was simple, yet dreadful. He would lead the temple guards there and identify Jesus with a kiss, a sign of affection perverted into a mark of betrayal. The decision to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver was not just a moment of personal failure for Judas. It was a climax of numerous factors, personal, political, and spiritual, that pushed a disillusioned man into committing one of the most notorious acts in Christian law. This act would not only seal his fate, but also cast a long shadow over his legacy, affecting how history would remember him. The scene is set in a dimly lit upper room in Jerusalem, suffused with the warm glow of oil lamps flickering against the rough-hewn walls. The air is filled with the mixed aromas of roasted lamb, fresh herbs, and bitter herbs, a stark reminder of the Passover meal's symbolism of liberation and suffering. Jesus and his disciples are gathered around a low wooden table, reclining on cushions, the mood both intimate and somber. This is the Last Supper, a pivotal moment, not just in Christian theology, but in the unfolding drama of betrayal that would change the course of history. As the meal progresses, Jesus speaks with a calm authority, his words heavy with meaning and unspoken sadness. He talks of the covenant, of his body and blood symbolized through bread and wine, foretelling the sacrifice that is to come. The disciples listen, confusion and concern etched on their faces, as the gravity of his words slowly dawns upon them. Then, in a moment laden with tension and foreboding, Jesus disrupts the meal's solemn tranquility with a startling revelation. One among them will betray him. The atmosphere thickens, the earlier camaraderie replaced by a growing unease. The disciples look at one another, suspicion and fear mingling in their eyes as they begin to question, "Surely you don't mean me, Lord?" Jesus, ever perceptive to the hearts of his followers, shares bread dipped in wine with Judas Iscariot, signifying the betrayer's identity. This gesture, steeped in cultural and religious significance, marks Judas not just as a traitor, but as a deeply conflicted figure, selected for the darkest of roles. Judas receives the morsel, and with it, the scripture notes, Satan entered into him. It's a profound depiction of the internal struggle within Judas, now overtaken by forces beyond his own initial contemplations. With a quiet nod, Jesus addresses Judas directly, an acknowledgement loaded with sorrow and inevitability. What you are about to do quickly. There is no anger in Jesus' voice, only the resigned weight of destiny unfolding as it must. Judas, his face a mask of inner turmoil, rises silently from the table. The clink of his sandals against the stone floor echoes in the tense silence as he exits into the cool night, leaving behind a room thick with dismay and confusion. This departure isn't just a physical exit from a place of warmth and fellowship. It's a poignant descent into isolation and infamy. As Judas steps out, the door closes softly behind him, symbolically sealing his fate and setting the stage for the harrowing events to follow. As the night deepened, Judas Iscariot found himself alone on the shadowy streets of Jerusalem, the echoes of Jesus' words haunting every step. His heart was heavy, his mind a whirlwind of conflict and resolution. The decision had been made, yet the gravity of his impending actions weighed on him with every moment. The cool night air was a stark contrast to the warmth of the room he had just left, a symbolic chill that matched the growing coldness within. Judas navigated through the narrow, twisting alleyways of the city, a route he knew well, but which now seemed alien and foreboding. His destination was the secluded residence where the high priests awaited his arrival. The meeting had been arranged swiftly following his departure from the supper, a testament to the urgency and secrecy required. The priests, cloaked in the anonymity of the night, were prepared for his arrival, their faces grim with anticipation of what was to come. Upon reaching the meeting place, Judas was met not with scorn, but with a disturbing reverence. The priests viewed him as a crucial instrument in their plan to seize Jesus away from the adoring masses. They quickly briefed him on the specifics: the time, the place, and the signal for identification. The 30 pieces of silver, the price of his betrayal, were presented again, this time as a final affirmation of his commitment. The coins glinted ominously in the dim light, each one a reminder of the transactional nature of his betrayal. With the pieces of silver now securely in his possession, Judas left the priests and made his way to assemble the temple guards provided by the authorities. These men were skilled in handling disturbances quietly and efficiently, essential for ensuring the arrest would not spark an uproar during the Passover festival. Judas briefed them on the plan, his voice steady, but his hands betraying a slight tremor. The group moved silently towards the Garden of Gethsemane, a known retreat for Jesus and his disciples, and the place Judas knew they would likely be found praying after the supper. As they approached, Judas's resolve hardened. The path he walked was irreversible. In these final moments before the betrayal, the quiet of the garden loomed large, a stark arena set for a confrontation that would echo through the ages. The Garden of Gethsemane, nestled at the foot of the Mount of Olives, was cloaked in the tranquility of night, its ancient olive trees casting long shadows under the moonlight. This serene setting stood in stark contrast to the turmoil churning within Judas as he led the temple guards through its secluded paths. The garden was a familiar place, a frequent spot for Jesus and his disciples to retreat for prayer and reflection, now the backdrop for a betrayal that would ripple through history. Inside the garden, Jesus was deeply immersed in prayer, grappling with the impending sacrifices and challenges he was about to face. The weight of what was to come was palpable, and his prayers were intense, a profound communion with his Father, seeking strength and solace. His disciples, weary from the day's events and overwhelmed by the gravity of their teacher's mood, had succumbed to sleep nearby, unaware of the approaching betrayal. As Judas entered the garden, the contrast between the peaceful surroundings and his own internal chaos was overwhelming. Each step was heavier than the last, laden with the gravity of his imminent act. The disciples, scattered around in slumber, were oblivious to the tension that accompanied their former companion and the armed men who quietly followed him. Approaching Jesus, who had just risen from a particularly fervent prayer, Judas knew his actions would soon unfold into irreversible consequences. Jesus, calm and composed, even in this dire hour, seemed prepared for what was coming. His understanding of human frailties and his own destiny allowed him to face Judas with a demeanor of serene acceptance. The moment of betrayal arrived when Judas stepped forward, the signal unmistakably clear. He approached Jesus, and with a feigned gesture of respect and affection, Judas kissed him on the cheek. This kiss, a common greeting among friends, was perverted into a sign of treachery. It was the agreed signal to the gods, marking Jesus unmistakably for arrest. The air seemed to still, time pausing briefly as the gravity of the kiss settled on all present. Jesus' response to Judas was poignant and filled with sorrowful acknowledgement. "Friend, do what you came for." These words, simple yet heavy with emotion, acknowledged Judas's conflicted nature and the tragic role he had chosen to play. As the guards stepped forward to seize Jesus, the stillness of the garden was shattered. The disciples awoke, startled and confused, scrambling to grasp the unfolding events. The peaceful garden had transformed into a scene of chaos and despair, marking the beginning of the end of Jesus' earthly ministry. As the silence of the garden broke under the rustle of soldiers advancing, the reality of Judas's deed hit with crushing force. The temple guards, now fully aware of their target thanks to Judas's signal, moved swiftly to apprehend Jesus. Despite the chaos erupting around him, Jesus remained a figure of calm authority, addressing everyone present with a composure that starkly contrasted the agitation of his disciples. The disciples, abruptly awakened from sleep to a scene of betrayal and arrest, reacted with a mix of fear, confusion, and anger. Simon Peter, ever impulsive, drew his sword in a desperate attempt to protect his master, cutting off the ear of Malchus, the servant of the high priest. This act of violence, in the face of Jesus' consistent message of peace, underlined the turmoil and confusion that gripped the disciples. Jesus, immediately addressing the situation, rebuked Peter for his rash action, healing the servant's ear with a touch. His response, "Put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword," echoed his teachings of nonviolence and submission to God's will. This moment served as a profound lesson to all present, reinforcing his message even in the face of imminent suffering. The atmosphere in the garden turned from one of quiet contemplation to palpable tension and sorrow. Jesus turned to the arresting party, questioning their need to approach him as if he were a leading insurrectionist, highlighting the irony and injustice of their actions. "Am I leading a rebellion that you have come with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me." Judas, standing apart now, watched as his rabbi was bound. The gravity of his actions fully dawned upon him in this moment as he witnessed the immediate consequences of his betrayal. The look of serene forgiveness on Jesus' face contrasted sharply with the cold efficiency of the temple guards. The betrayal, while foretold, seemed surreal to him now, a stark deviation from any outcomes he might have rationalized. As the guards led Jesus away, the disciples fled in fear and disarray, leaving Jesus isolated with his captors. The scene concluded with a profound sense of tragedy and foreboding, marking the beginning of Jesus' final journey towards crucifixion. Judas, isolated by his deed, retreated into the shadows, the weight of his treachery enveloping him in profound solitude and regret. As the temple guards led Jesus away from the Garden of Gethsemane, the night air seemed to thicken with despair. The disciples, scattered in panic and fear, disappeared into the darkness, leaving their master in the hands of his captors. This moment marked not only the physical separation of Jesus from his closest followers, but also the emotional and spiritual disarray that would haunt them in the hours to come. Judas, meanwhile, stood at the periphery, a silent observer to the unraveling consequences of his actions. The shock of the unfolding scene before him clashed violently with any justifications he had previously entertained. As the reality of his betrayal fully set in, Judas was consumed by a deepening spiral of remorse and isolation. The silver coins that had once seemed a reward now burned in his possession like a mark of his guilt. Back in the garden, the lingering presence of divine healing, where Jesus had healed the servant's ear, stood in stark contrast to the betrayal's chaos. This act of compassion, even in the face of betrayal, highlighted the profound message of forgiveness and redemption central to Jesus' teachings. Yet, for Judas, the path to redemption seemed increasingly out of reach, overshadowed by the gravity of his treachery. In the high priest's courtyard, Jesus faced interrogations and mockery. The initial proceedings were filled with false testimonies and accusations, a foretaste of the injustice that would climax at his trial. Throughout these ordeals, Jesus maintained a demeanor of composed fortitude, answering only when he affirmed his identity and mission, further fulfilling the prophecies that had foretold these events. For the disciples, the night was one of soul-searching and fear. Peter, who had earlier drawn his sword in defense of Jesus, now found himself thrice denying any association with him out of fear for his own safety, a fulfillment of another of Jesus' predictions. This act of denial, juxtaposed with Judas's betrayal, added layers of failure and human frailty to the narrative. As dawn approached, the consequences of Judas's betrayal expanded beyond the immediate arrest. The disciples' fear and disarray mirrored the broader confusion and fear that would grip the followers of Jesus. The fabric of their faith was deeply shaken, tested by the events that would lead to the crucifixion. Judas, unable to bear the weight of his guilt, made the tragic decision to end his life, a final act that underscored the devastating impact of his betrayal. This act, while concluding Judas's earthly story, left an indelible mark on the narrative of Jesus' passion, serving as a stark reminder of the cost of betrayal and the depths of despair it can engender. In the hours following Jesus' arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane, a palpable sense of shock and fear enveloped his disciples. The swift and secret manner in which Judas had orchestrated the betrayal left them scattered and hiding, fearing that they too might be rounded up by the authorities. The group that had once shared close companionship and profound teachings under Jesus was now fragmented, each member grappling with the harsh reality of their leader's capture and their own uncertain futures. Meanwhile, the religious leaders, primarily the Sanhedrin, convened an emergency session under the cover of night to address what they perceived as a growing threat from Jesus' influence. The trial was hastily arranged and fraught with irregularities, lacking proper witnesses and legal procedures. Despite these shortcomings, the high priests and their associates were driven by a mixture of fear, envy, and political calculation. Their swift actions reflected a deep-seated urgency to suppress any movement that could destabilize their power or provoke Roman intervention. As these events unfolded, Judas's isolation became profound. The reality of his betrayal materialized before him, not just as a singular act of treachery, but as a catalyst for what would become a series of traumatic events for many. Overwhelmed by guilt and despair, Judas attempted to return the 30 pieces of silver, seeking to undo his actions. However, the chief priests refused to accept the money, deeming it blood money, which further alienated and tormented Judas. This rejection by the very individuals who had once encouraged his betrayal was the final straw for Judas. In a state of utter desolation, he took his own life, a tragic end that underscored the depth of his remorse and the irreversible nature of his actions. This act not only marked a sorrowful conclusion to his story, but also left a lasting imprint on the collective memory of those who would continue to recount the events of those days. The disciples, meanwhile, were left to navigate their grief and confusion. Peter, who had denied knowing Jesus 3 times, embodied the profound personal crises each disciple faced. These immediate hours were marked by an intense personal reckoning. Each disciple confronted the fragility of their faith and loyalty in the face of mortal danger. The long-term repercussions of Judas Iscariot's betrayal extended far beyond the immediate events surrounding Jesus' arrest and crucifixion. As Christianity began to spread, the narrative of Judas and his betrayal became a central theme in Christian theology, serving as a powerful lesson on sin, redemption, and the complexities of human nature.